The following is a recording of Dr. Elizabeth Evans speaking to an online audience under the title State Overreach in the Healthcare of Children and the Elderly Vulnerable. The meeting was hosted by the Christians Together online ministry. Dr. Liz is the CEO of the UK Medical Freedom Alliance, and she is seen speaking on Monday, 10th of June 2024. The following day, the UK MFA launched the People's Vaccine Inquiry. Before moving to the main recording itself, you will first see Liz introducing a short video clip of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. speaking. She showed this extract at a Health and Truth conference in Ireland in 2021. Kennedy, who speaks through a speech impairment, heads up the US-based Children's Health Defence.
He's got problems with his voice, so you just have to focus on what he's saying.
My father told me when I was a child, people in authority lie. And if we are going to continue to live in a democracy, we need to understand that people in authority lie. People in authority will abuse every power that we relinquish to them. And right now we are giving them the power to micromanage every bit of our lives 24 hours a day. They're going to know where we are. They're going to know the money that we spend. They're going to have access to our children. They're going to have the right to compel unwanted medical interventions on us. The Nazis did that in the camps in World War II. They tested vaccines on gypsies and Jews. And the world was so horrified after the war, we signed the Nuremberg Charter. And we all pledge when we do that, we would never again impose unwanted medical interventions on human beings without informed consent. And yet in 2 years, all of that conviction has suddenly disappeared. And people are walking around in masks where the science has not been explained to them. They are doing what they're told. They are these government agencies are orchestrating obedience. It is not democratic. It's not the product of democracy. It's the product of a pharmaceutical-driven biosecurity agenda that will enslave the entire human race and plunge us into a dystopian nightmare where the apocalyptical forces of ignorance and greed will be running our lives and ruining our children and destroying all the dreams and dignity that we hope to give to our children.
So good evening, everyone. It's been lovely to see all your faces just appearing on the screen, all smiling and looking very happy on a beautiful summer evening. So thanks for joining us, and thanks very much, Colin, for the invitation. So as Colin said, I'm going to introduce myself. So I'm a former NHS doctor. I now work in complementary medicine, and I've been a passionate campaigner on health and ethics issues for well over a decade. Then in October 2020, I co-founded the UK Medical Freedom Alliance. And for the last 3.5 years, we have repeatedly sought to engage with government ministers, regulators, policymakers, decision makers, and healthcare professionals. And we have been presenting an evidence-based and rational perspective on unethical and dangerous policies. But sadly, we have been largely ignored, and we have even been smeared and censored. So I would argue that we have experienced, above all, a pandemic of ethical violations over the last 4 years. During the COVID era, we've seen fundamental ethical principles abandoned. And as we come out of this period, it's really apparent that medical ethics are being violated in many other areas of healthcare, particularly in relation to our children, which is what I want to focus on this evening. So just to get you started, I like this quote from a US Supreme Court justice who said, "Ethics is knowing the difference between what you have a right to do and what is right to do." And on that note, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the basic principles of medical ethics. So these are the vital framework that recognise and uphold the equal value, worth, and dignity of every individual, and their right to freely decide what happens to their own bodies. They exist to hold healthcare professionals accountable for their actions and to protect vulnerable patients from abuse and atrocities, because there is an unavoidable power imbalance in the doctor-patient relationship. So as such, a healthcare professional is obliged to follow 4 key ethical principles. The first is autonomy, and this is the respect for a patient's right to self-determination over their own body and their freedom to accept or reject medical interventions. And I would argue that this is the foundation on which all other human rights are built. Then we have beneficence, which is the duty of a doctor to act for the benefit of their patient, to do good. Non-malfeasance is the duty of a doctor to do no harm. So the benefit of any treatment should outweigh the risk to that individual patient. And finally, doctors have a duty to treat all people equally, to do it with justice. There is a legal and ethical requirement that informed consent must be obtained for all medical treatment. This involves a clinician disclosing all material risks, benefits, and alternatives to treatment. This consent is only valid if obtained without coercion or pressure being applied. For example, the threat of a penalty if consent is refused. And privacy and confidentiality are also vital. Now, in the case of children who don't have the maturity to consent, in the vast majority of cases, parents are required to consent for them. So on that note, it's important just to get 2 key points clear. Firstly, medical ethics are vitally important and should be non-negotiable in a civilized society. And secondly, we cannot just discard medical ethics in an emergency for the greater good. This is when decisions are most likely to be driven by panic or fear, so thus making abuse more likely. So we need to ensure that the maxim first do no harm is always upheld, and a full risk-benefit analysis applied to all interventions for both the individual and wider society. Now, these pictures probably bring back many bad memories you would rather forget. We've seen many examples of ethical violations over the last 4 years and the normalization of the unethical. And sadly, many of these abuses of power involved our children. And this is the context, these pictures, in which this discussion going forward must be framed. Now, as a Christian, I believe you can judge a tree by its fruit. So that's how you will understand if a policy is right or wrong, good or evil. So I'm just going to ask you to look at these pictures and ask you, what do you see? I see pain, suffering, and cruelty. I see gross examples of man's inhumanity to man. And I think that this is what unethical looks like. And importantly, this was a choice. So the failure over the last 4 years of the government, public health authorities, and most importantly, the medical profession, to uphold the ethical principles that have always framed and constrained the delivery of healthcare to ensure that we first do no harm, has led to significant suffering and death. There was a complete failure to see the bigger picture, as political and medical decisions were made in a moral and ethical vacuum, and we cannot allow this approach to continue. So moving on to state overreach into children's healthcare decisions. I'm sure you will agree that marriage and the family are the fundamental building blocks for a strong society. And in history, we have repeatedly seen that attacks on the family through state overreach lead to the breakdown of society. Therefore, parents must always be wary of any attempts by the state to override their parental rights and intrude into the sacred space of the family. We have become concerned over several ways that this is currently happening in relation to our children's healthcare decisions, where there is sidelining of parents in favour of the NHS and the state. And in the next half an hour or so, I'm going to cover the increasing medicalisation of schools as a setting for public health measures and the administration of healthcare interventions such as vaccines. I'm also going to look at how the NHS has been directing propaganda and fear-mongering at children. And finally, how the NHS has been seeking to deal directly with children, completely cutting parents out of healthcare decisions. So, starting with the ethics of vaccination in schools. We at the UK Medical Freedom Alliance are really concerned about the increasing medicalisation of schools, particularly the use of schools by the NHS as vaccination venues. Now, I'm a parent of 4 children, and I'm only too aware of how prevalent this issue is now. I'm constantly receiving notifications of visits by the NHS vaccination team, often more than once a year to a particular year group. This is very different to 40 years ago when I was at school. I remember having 1, possibly 2 vaccinations in school. I had my rubella. I remember lining up, but that was the only time. So really, that was a very rare occurrence. For our children today, this is, a constant interruption. Now, we believe that schools should be a place to deliver education to a child, not healthcare. It's not an appropriate place to administer vaccinations or any medical intervention, particularly because the medical professionals in the vaccination teams don't know the individual children or their medical histories, unlike a child's own GP or practice nurse, who are far better placed to ensure that any intervention is appropriate for that individual child and only given with full and informed consent. Blurring the line between education and healthcare in the context of schools raises important ethical questions. Firstly, administering vaccinations in this environment is impossible to do without compromising individual confidentiality and privacy. And these are both really crucial tenets in the provision of ethical medical care. I know from my children's experience, pupils are acutely aware which children in their class have not taken a particular vaccine, and this can be a source of great stress and shame for those who are not in the majority. Secondly, without their parents for support and protection, children become highly susceptible to peer pressure from fellow pupils on vaccine day. And they're also heavily influenced by the opinions of their teachers, which are sometimes overtly stated. And they naturally feel under pressure to follow the crowd. So as you can see, this creates a coercive and very unsafe environment, which is completely inappropriate for an individual medical decision. And from an educational perspective, valuable lesson time is lost and lessons are significantly disrupted on vaccination days. And it appears that the situation is worsening because the powers that be seem to be seeking more use of schools to immunise and indoctrinate children. So this year, we were very disturbed in January to come across this 8-page policy briefing from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And it was all about school-age immunisation services in England, which is abbreviated to SACE. And this briefing states a desire to further hijack schools and their captive children to promote and meet vaccine targets. And I've included some excerpts on this slide. But briefly, they firstly identify a decline in children's vaccine uptake since COVID. I wonder why. And recommend that the Department of Education need to work very closely with the Department of Health and Social Care to help SACE offer 100% of the eligible children and young people all the vaccines that are on the schedule, and that is a lot these days. And they want to increase regional and national vaccine uptake levels and reduce inequalities in uptake. Now, the writers of this policy lament the fact that currently, quotes, schools are not required to engage with or collaborate with SACE or support vaccine delivery on school premises. So their main recommendation is that in future, all schools, whether they're independent or state schools, should be required by law to do the following things, which you can see in bold on the slide. So they are briefly to have measures in place to support SACE to deliver the vaccines on site, for example, space and time for the delivery of these vaccines in the school schedule. That schools should be required by law to comply with the official guidance that schools can permit to share contact, are permitted to share contact details of pupils and parents with SACE, because they want to help facilitate offers of vaccination and consent pathways. They also want it to be a legal requirement that schools disseminate vaccine programme information and invitations from SACE to parents, that they nominate a dedicated staff member to liaise with SACE. They call for these requirements to be part of Ofsted inspections and want the requirement that a local authority education service collaborate with and support the SACE teams. Now, we believe it's highly coercive to force schools by law to disseminate this often one-sided schools immunisation service literature to parents, and also to force schools to enable the vaccinators to easily access the children, especially when you use Ofsted as an enforcer. This will rob schools of their autonomy and make it much harder for parents and teachers to question and challenge any policies. Schools must retain their independence and be allowed to make autonomous decisions as to whether they wish to be involved in state-run public health programmes, and that has to be based on their assessment of what is in the best interest of the children in their care, on a case-by-case basis, and balancing all their needs, not just the need or otherwise for a vaccine. So we dug a little bit deeper into this policy briefing, and we discovered that the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, who produced it, is closely linked with something called the Vaccine Confidence Project, which was established by the London School of Hygiene's Professor Heidi Larson in 2010. So the policy briefing supports this VCP agenda, which is to better understand growing vaccine skepticism around the world. And then if you dig further into the Vaccine Confidence Project, you discover that the funders and partners of the VCP include many multinational pharmaceutical companies, such as Merck, AstraZeneca, and GlaxoSmithKline, and they all stand to profit from any increase in uptake of vaccines. Therefore, the briefing is not a politically neutral document, but it's being supported by powerful vested interests whose business models involve getting needles into the arms of as many children as possible. Now, on the left here, we see an image of what education should be about in the picture, which is sort of red. But on the right, we see a joint NHS and UK Health Security Agency briefing for secondary schools explaining their role in the adolescent vaccination programme. And this shows a worrying blurring of the lines between education and healthcare. And then in the London School of Hygiene policy briefing, they advocate for the teaching of corporate propaganda in the guise of, quotes, accurate information and providing appropriate educational materials that promote vaccine confidence. Surely this risks turning education into indoctrination, where children are taught what to think instead of how to think. And we have seen teaching on vaccines and vaccine ideology creep into many parts of the curriculum, even beyond science and PHSE, and from nursery level to A levels. And I just did a quick Google search and I found thousands of vaccination learning resources online for teachers and schools to use, and it goes from all ages, from 3 to 18. This shows that vaccination is a key part of the curricula. Now, this is just a small selection of some of the resources I found. So we had a book on vaccines aimed at babies, Baby Medical School. Then we had a reading comprehension, so for English or tutor time, on, quote, the rise of anti-vaxxers. Then there's a biology lesson tasked to create a leaflet for a doctor's surgery to encourage vaccination, and a biology lesson plan to include a discussion as to whether we are morally required to get ourselves vaccinated. I think this is powerful corporate propaganda, and I would argue is more about indoctrination than education. So over the last 3 to 4 years, I think it's been a real wake-up call. We've seen how powerful the pharmaceutical industry is and how lucrative a business model it is to vaccinate all healthy children. So with such powerful vested interests lobbying for more and more access to our children, it is surely time to draw a line and take all healthcare interventions out of schools and back into general practice where it belongs. The UK Medical Freedom Alliance advocate for the following guidelines to be implemented. We believe medical discussions, decisions and interventions for children should only happen in the privacy of a consultation with their own GP or practice nurse, who knows them and has access to their medical history. This will increase the accountability of the named medical professional involved. And secondly, a child should always be accompanied by a parent when accessing any medical intervention, and the healthcare professional should follow a proper process of informed consent, discussing risks and benefits in an open and non-coercive way, and the decision made by the parents, with or without input from the child, should be accepted and respected. Now we move on to some promotional material from the NHS. So in March 2024, the UK Health Security Agency launched this promotional video jointly with the NHS, which was part of an expensive marketing campaign to drive up child vaccination rates, particularly for measles and whooping cough. Now, we were appalled at the cynical use of children in this video to target parents in a highly coercive way. Many emotive claims made in the advert are highly sensational, and the risks of the illness to individual children appear to be exaggerated and unquantified, and will promote parents' fear for their children's safety. And it's only 20-30 seconds long, so I'm going to show it to you now so you can see for yourself. Let's see, make sure I can do this.
Our generation's risk of illnesses, like measles and whooping cough, is rising.
If we're not vaccinated, we're not protected and could get seriously ill. Risk and lifelong disabilities. Are your child's vaccines up to date?
Okay. So moving on. Hang on. Right. So in response to this NHS advert, we put out a short video statement ourselves on our YouTube and Rumble channels. And in it, we made the following points. So no medicine is without side effects or completely safe. Yet, in the video of the UK HSA, there is no mention of potential side effects from the vaccines. This therefore violates the law on informed consent, which requires a full disclosure of risks as well as benefits from any medical intervention to allow an individualized risk-benefit analysis. Then the statement, if we're not vaccinated, we're not protected, is actually factually inaccurate because it completely ignores the innate protection provided by a healthy, God-given immune system that enables the vast majority of children to sail through childhood infections without complications, particularly if they're nursed well and supportively. Instead of fear-mongering, public health authorities should be empowering parents with information about treatments that reduce the severity of measles and almost eliminate the risk of complication. For example, high doses of vitamin C are actually advised by the World Health Organization in their guidance for prophylaxis and treatment in measles outbreaks, but that never gets a mention in the UK. Using children to advertise vaccinations is exploitative and unethical, and may be in breach of the Advertising Standards Authority Code of Advertising and the government's own advice on advertising medication. It's highly likely that older children will see and be influenced by this advert to demand the vaccine through fear for their own safety, which would further breach the rules. Our conclusion was that this was a deplorable and cynical use of children to propagandize parents to accept a vaccine for their child that they may not personally benefit from or may experience harm from, and that this is not an ethical, responsible or sober way to practice medicine. And now we move on to the NHS seeking to directly deal with children. So we were horrified to learn recently that the NHS is now sending letters directly to children in their homes. So this letter was sent to a child about to turn 13 years, so i.e. a 12-year-old child, informing them that they can now make their own health decisions, including making appointments and seeing a doctor or nurse alone. Now, I'm going to give you a minute just to read through this letter, so I'm just going to be quiet, and I'm sure you'll be as outraged as we are at the content. So have a read. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to have a quick skim through that. Now, the statement that the child's wish for confidentiality would always be respected unless there is a risk of serious harm, and that the parent's contact details would be removed from the child's records is surely a serious safeguarding issue. Astonishingly, the child was asked to fill in and returned an enclosed form with their own phone and email address as contact details. And if they wish to have a parent or guardian continue to be involved in their care, they had to give written consent in advance. So this raised a number of red flags, and we have several serious safeguarding concerns about this letter. It is completely unacceptable to exclude parents from their child's healthcare decisions. Parents should be fully involved in their child's medical choices because children under 16 simply don't have the skills or knowledge to make complex medical decisions alone without parental support and input. Then most children under 16 lack the organisational skills to make medical appointments and naturally will rely on their parents to do this for them. Most children are at school during the working day and they would really struggle to telephone to make or receive an appointment. And we're deeply concerned that preventing parents from accessing medical care for their child will result in neglect or a delayed presentation of illness, which could be life-threatening. It is also concerning that the mechanism for a child to consent to parental involvement is opt-in rather than opt-out. So it's highly likely that most children will fail to action this, and parents could find themselves unable to access care on behalf of their child at a time when their child is acutely unwell, or perhaps emotionally vulnerable. If parental involvement is removed, the most vulnerable children, such as those with chronic illness, mental health problems, learning difficulties, or from dysfunctional backgrounds, may be unable to access care at all. And we feel that the burden of responsibility of making their own health decisions in secrecy and unsupported by loving parents may cause unnecessary stress and anxiety for all children. So in conclusion, this letter to a 12-year-old completely violates medical ethics and invalidates informed consent. Full parental involvement is the norm for consultations involving children and young people and must remain so. Most children under 16 require the help of their parents to fully understand the complexity and wider implications of medical decisions, and healthcare professionals have a duty of care to ensure that this happens. And it seems to us that the NHS is misusing or misunderstanding the concept of Gillick competency that you may have heard of. This is the understanding that children under 16 years can, in certain circumstances, make their own medical decisions, and was ruled by the Supreme Court in a 1985 case of Gillick versus West Norfolk and Wisbech Health Authority. This case saw authorization for a doctor to prescribe the contraceptive pill to a sexually active minor without parental knowledge or involvement. However, Gillick was never intended for the blanket removal of all parental involvement in healthcare for all under 16s, and it's only applicable in exceptional cases. When you read the judgment, it's very clear that deciding competence for under 16s is decision-specific, child-specific, made only with the specific factual context in mind and based on the available evidence. It can only be determined by a medical practitioner who knows the child, and they must ensure and document that the child has enough intelligence, competence, and understanding to fully appreciate what is involved in their treatment. And Lord Scarman in the judgment stated, no reasonable person could read it as meaning that the doctor's discretion could ordinarily override parental right. Illustrations are given in the text of exceptional cases in which the doctor may take the most unusual course of not consulting the parent. Only in exceptional cases does the guidance contemplate him exercising his clinical judgment without the parent's knowledge and consent. So I think that is really clear. And the worst example of NHS overreach we have seen was this letter sent by Unity Health, which was a sort of GP practice group, for the attention of a 10-year-old child. And it was shared with us by their concerned parent. And I'm actually going to read it to you. So it says, dear parent or guardian of X, but then it starts to address the child. We are writing to you as you are approaching your 11th birthday. This means we need to ensure the contact details on your record are your own. If your contact details belong to your parent guardian and you wish to update them to your own, please get in touch with us via email. Alternatively, you can come into the surgery or call us. If the contact details on your record belong to your parent guardian and you wish for them to remain on your record, you will need to complete a third-party consent form. This will grant your parent or guardian access to your medical record. You can specify which areas of your record you want them to have access to and for how long you want that access to last. The form can be found online at our website and if you can't access the online form, you can come into either surgery to request the form from the reception team. Kind regards. So I'm sure you will agree with me that no child should be subject to direct approaches from a GP practice regarding their medical care, particularly a 10-year-old. It is deeply sinister. And I'm sure you will agree that it is completely unacceptable for adults to contact other people's children in this way, especially at the age of 10, or to attempt to involve them in adult processes and decisions in this way. To suggest that a child of 10 shares their personal contact details or travels alone to the practice to fill in forms that they are unlikely to fully comprehend is surely a child protection issue. The lack of scrutiny and secrecy of the resulting communications between the child and the GP practice would be a red flag in all other interactions between a child and unrelated adult in our society, and is by its nature coercive due to the extreme imbalance of power and knowledge. So we sent an open letter to the managing partner of Unity Health, who had sent the letter in February 2024, and you can find that published in full on our website. We asked her to respond as a matter of urgency to the safeguarding concerns raised, but have had no response. So it's unclear whether this sort of practice is confined to a few rogue GP practices and NHS trusts, or whether it's a more established national NHS policy. But it should be a wake-up call to parents. It's now abundantly clear that our children are being targeted in a predatory way and need our protection. There is a sinister and deliberate attempt by the state to take over medical decisions for children and to put them in charge of their own healthcare in a completely age-inappropriate way. Parents who love and care for their children and know them best are being deliberately and systematically pushed aside. This constitutes a direct attack by the state through the NHS on the family, threatening the rights of parents to be involved in or make healthcare decisions for their own children. And the beneficiaries are the pharmaceutical industry in profits. We have a moral and ethical duty as a society to protect children from harm and exploitation. So parents must push back against this gross state overreach and stand firm to protect their children from the nanny state. So thank you for listening. I just wanted to say a quick word about the UK Medical Freedom Alliance. We rely entirely on donations from the public to run the UK MFA. So if you've appreciated this talk and value our work, please consider making a small monthly donation just by buying us a coffee or two, because we want to continue to campaign for your right to medical choice, informed consent and bodily autonomy to be held. We're really keen to expand our work to tackle the many threats to our medical freedom that are coming down the line and urgently need more resources to do this. And you will find a donate button on our website in the top right-hand corner. Please also subscribe to and like our free podcast with some brilliant interviews with prominent medical ethics doctors and campaigners. And you can see it in video form on our Rumble and YouTube channels and on audio on all the major podcast platforms like Spotify, Apple. And please follow us on Twitter and Facebook and sign up on our website to our email newsletter, because that will give you important news and campaign updates with calls to action. And all this information can be found on the website, which is ukmedfreedom.org. Thanks again for listening.
Following the presentation, the meeting moved on to a question and answer session with Dr. Evans.